The Kansas plains stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of grass that rippled in the wind like water beneath the endless sky. It was 1885, and the frontier was slowly dying, replaced by fences, railroads, and the kind of civilization that had no place for men like Samuel "Iron Sam" McCready. At 63, Sam was one of the last of his kind, a professional gunfighter whose reputation had been forged in the violent crucible of the Civil War and tempered in 30 years of frontier justice. His weathered face bore the map of every conflict he'd survived, and his pale gray eyes held the empty coldness of a man who'd seen too much death to be moved by the prospect of more. Sam rode a dun-colored Mustang, named Judgment, a horse as scarred and battle-tested as its rider. His twin Colt .45s hung low on his hips, their grips worn smooth by decades of use, and his Winchester rifle rested in its scabbard with the casual readiness of a tool that might be needed at any moment. Everything about Sam's appearance spoke of lethal competence. He was death incarnate, a relic of a more violent time when disputes were settled with lead rather than law. He was tracking a young Kiowa warrior named Running Eagle, wanted for the murder of 3 white settlers near Fort Dodge. The bounty was substantial, $500, dead or alive, and Sam needed the money to sustain what remained of his fading lifestyle. The days when gunfighters could make a living settling disputes for wealthy ranchers were coming to an end, replaced by courts and lawyers, and the kind of civilized processes that made men like Sam obsolete. This bounty might be his last, the final payment for a lifetime of violence in service to causes that now seemed meaningless. The trail had led him across 300 miles of prairie, following sign that only someone with his experience could read. Running Eagle was good, better than most white trackers Sam had encountered, but the young warrior was operating in country that Sam had known for 40 years. Every waterhole, every defensible position, every escape route was familiar territory to the old gunfighter, and he'd been slowly tightening the noose for weeks. The confrontation, when it came, would be decisive. Sam had no intention of giving the young brave a chance to slip away again. Running Eagle was 19 years old, tall and lean with the natural grace of someone who'd been born to the saddle. His dark eyes held the fierce intelligence of a warrior who understood that he was fighting not just for his own life, but for the honor of his people and the memory of the settlers who had died by his hand. He had killed the 3 whites not out of random savagery, but in retaliation for the massacre of his own family during a cavalry raid that had been covered up by the military authorities. Justice, from his perspective, demanded blood for blood, and he was prepared to pay the ultimate price for his actions. The young warrior had been running for 6 weeks, using every trick he'd learned from childhood to stay ahead of his pursuers. He'd doubled back on his own trail, used streams to hide his tracks, and taken refuge in sacred places where he hoped white men wouldn't dare to follow. But Sam McCready was unlike any bounty hunter Running Eagle had encountered. The old gunfighter seemed to anticipate his moves, appearing like a specter wherever the young brave thought he'd found safety. The chase had taken on an almost supernatural quality, as if fate itself was driving the 2 men toward an inevitable confrontation. Running Eagle's horse was beginning to show signs of exhaustion, and his own supplies were running dangerously low. He knew that he couldn't run much longer. Soon, he would have a turn and fight, accepting whatever destiny the spirits had chosen for him. The prospect didn't frighten him. He had always known that warriors died young, and he had made his peace with that reality. What concerned him was the possibility that his death would be meaningless, that the white authorities would use it to justify further atrocities against his people. Sam, meanwhile, was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. The longer he pursued the young warrior, the more he found himself questioning the justice of what he was doing. The official story painted Running Eagle as a savage killer who'd murdered innocent settlers, but Sam's own investigation had uncovered details that painted a more complex picture. The innocent settlers had been part of a group that had been selling whiskey to tribal members in violation of federal law, and their deaths had occurred during a confrontation that they had initiated. More troubling was the discovery that Running Eagle's family had been killed just days before the settlers' deaths, suggesting that the young warrior's actions had been motivated by grief and rage rather than random violence. The final confrontation took place at dawn on a wind-swept hilltop that the Kiowa considered sacred, a place where their ancestors had once conducted vision quests and communed with the spirit world. Running Eagle had chosen location deliberately, knowing that if he was going to die, he wanted it to be on ground that held meaning for his people. The hill commanded a view of the surrounding prairie for miles in every direction, ensuring that there would be no surprises and no escape for either combatant. Sam arrived just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of blood and fire. He could see Running Eagle waiting for him at the summit, sitting cross-legged beside his exhausted horse with his rifle across his knees. The young warrior's face was painted with traditional symbols that spoke of preparation for death, and his posture radiated the kind of calm acceptance that Sam recognized from his own experiences with mortality. The old gunfighter dismounted at the base of the hill and began the slow climb to the summit, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. Every step brought him closer to a moment that would define the remainder of his life, though he didn't yet understand the full implications of what was about to happen. His hand rested on the butt of his Colt, ready to draw at the first sign of hostile movement, but something about the young warrior's bearing suggested that this wouldn't be a conventional gunfight. When Sam reached the summit, he found Running Eagle exactly as he'd appeared from a distance, calm, prepared, and utterly without fear. The young warrior's dark eyes met his own without flinching, and Sam saw in him a depth of character that surprised him. This wasn't the savage killer described in the wanted poster, but a young man who'd been pushed beyond endurance by circumstances beyond his control. "You have followed me far, old man," Running Eagle said in English that was precise and unaccented. "I honor your skill and your persistence." Sam nodded, recognizing the formal courtesy that characterized interactions between worthy opponents. "You gave me a good chase, boy. I'll grant you that." The two men studied each other in the growing light, each taking the measure of his opponent and finding more than he'd expected. This was no longer simply a matter of hunter and prey, but something approaching mutual respect between professionals who understood the deadly serious nature of their business. "Why?" Sam asked, the question carrying more weight than its single syllable would suggest. He wasn't asking about tactics or motivation in any simple sense, but about the deeper currents that had brought them both to this isolated hilltop at the edge of the known world. Running Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on a horizon where the sun was slowly climbing into a cloudless sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of grief that had been held in check for too long. 3 days before I killed the whiskey sellers, cavalry soldiers came to our camp. They said we were harboring warriors who had raided white settlements. It was a lie. Our band had been peaceful, following the treaty terms exactly as promised. The young warrior's hands tightened on his rifle, but his voice remained steady. "They killed my father while he was trying to show them the treaty papers. They killed my mother because she tried to protect my little sister. They killed my sister because—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sam understood. He'd seen enough cavalry actions to know how they typically ended when there were no witnesses to report the details. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sam said, and meant it. The words seemed inadequate, but they were the only ones he had to offer in the face of such grief. "My parents died when I was younger than you. Different circumstances, but dead is dead." Running Eagle nodded, recognizing the shared experience of orphanhood that connected them across racial lines. The whiskey sellers were there that night. They guided the soldiers to our camp, told them where to find the women and children. They thought it was funny. They laughed while my family died. The young warrior's voice carried a note of iron that explained everything Sam needed to know about his subsequent actions. This hadn't been random violence, but calculated revenge against people who participated in the destruction of innocence. "So you tracked them down," Sam observed. "All 3 of them." "Justice demanded blood for blood," Running Eagle replied simply. "They died as my family died, quickly but without honor." Sam felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the moral complexity that surrounded the situation. The young warrior sitting before him wasn't a mindless savage or a casual killer, but someone who'd been driven to violence by a chain of events that had started with the very people he'd ultimately killed. The law might call it murder, but Sam's own sense of frontier justice suggested that Running Eagle had been operating under an older, more fundamental code. The sun continued its slow climb into the Kansas sky, casting long shadows across the sacred hilltop, where 2 warriors faced each other in the eternal dance of predator and prey. Sam found himself studying Running Eagle's face with new eyes, seeing not the faceless enemy described in the wanted poster, but a young man who reminded him uncomfortably of his own lost youth. There was something about the warrior's bearing, the quiet dignity, the acceptance of whatever fate awaited him, that spoke to parts of Sam's character that he thought had died decades ago. "You know I have to take you in," Sam said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction that had characterized the pursuit of other fugitives. "There's a bounty on your head, and people expect me to collect it." Running Eagle smiled, an expression that was both sad and understanding. "You are a hunter, old man. It is your nature to hunt, just as it was my nature to seek revenge for my family. We are both prisoners of what we are." The observation was more profound than Sam was prepared to deal with, cutting as it did to the heart of his own existential crisis. For 30 years, he defined himself as a man who killed for money, a professional whose services were available to anyone willing to pay his price. But somewhere along the way, that simple identity had become complicated by questions of justice, morality, and the weight of accumulated violence that pressed down on his soul like a physical burden. "Maybe so," Sam admitted, "but we still have choices about how we play the hand we're dealt." Running Eagle's eyes sharpened with interest. "You speak of choices. What choice do you see here, old man?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything Sam had been wrestling with during the long pursuit. The letter of the law said that Running Eagle was a murderer who deserved to hang for his crimes. But the spirit of justice suggested that the young warrior had been acting in accordance with older, more fundamental principles that transcended the arbitrary boundaries of white man's law. More personally, Sam was beginning to understand that this confrontation represented something larger than a simple bounty collection. It was a test of who he was and what he stood for in the twilight of his violent career. "Stand up," Sam said quietly, his hand moving to his gun. "Let's get this finished." Running Eagle rose to his feet with fluid grace, his rifle held casually but ready to be brought into action at a moment's notice. The two men faced each other across 10 feet of frost-covered ground, their eyes locked in a kind of mutual assessment that preceded violence between professionals. Sam could see that the young warrior was fast, probably faster than most men he'd faced, but speed alone wouldn't be enough to overcome 30 years of experience and the kind of cold calculation that kept Sam alive through countless similar confrontations. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Sam's hand hovered over his coat, his mind calculating angles and timing with the automatic precision of long practice. All he had to do was draw and fire. One quick motion that would end the chase and earn him $500 in bounty money. It was what he'd been hired to do, what he'd spent weeks preparing for, what everyone expected from a man with his reputation. But as his fingers touched the worn grip of his pistol, something unexpected happened. Instead of the familiar coldness that usually preceded killing, Sam felt a wave of weariness that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. Time seemed to slow as Sam's hand hovered over his gun, the weight of 3 decades of violence pressing down on him like a physical force. He could feel the familiar coldness trying to assert itself, the emotional numbness that had allowed him to kill without hesitation or regret. But something was different this time, something that made his finger reluctant to complete the motion that would end Running Eagle's life and add another notch to his already blood-soaked reputation. The young warrior waited with the patient stillness of someone who'd made peace with mortality, his dark eyes never leaving Sam's face. There was no fear in his expression, no pleading or attempt at negotiation, just the quiet acceptance of a man who understood that death was simply another part of life's journey. That dignity, more than any argument or appeal, gave Sam pause. In 30 years of gunfighting, he'd faced desperate men, cowards, bullies, and genuine killers, but he'd rarely encountered someone who faced death with such grace. "Draw," Running Eagle said quietly, his voice carrying an odd note of compassion. "I can see the burden you carry, old man. End this quickly, for both our sakes." The words were meant to be merciful, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of triggering the automatic response of professional killer, they awakened something in Sam that he thought was dead, his conscience. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking not about the mechanics of killing, but about the moral weight of taking a life. This young warrior had killed 3 men, but he'd done so for reasons that Sam understood and, if he was honest with himself, respected. The whiskey sellers had participated in the massacre of innocents, and frontier justice had always recognized the right of family members to seek revenge for such crimes. By the older, more fundamental laws that had governed the West before lawyers and courts arrived, Running Eagle's actions had been not only justified but necessary. Sam's hand trembled slightly as he struggled with a decision that would define the remainder of his life. He could kill Running Eagle and collect his bounty, maintaining his reputation, and earning enough money to sustain him for several more months. Or he could do something unprecedented in his long career. He could choose mercy over money, compassion over professional obligation. "I can't," Sam said suddenly, his hand falling away from his gun. "I can't do it." Running Eagle's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not having expected this development. "What do you mean, old man?" "I mean, I'm not going to kill you," Sam replied, his voice growing stronger as he committed to the decision. "I've killed enough young men in my time. I don't need to kill another one, especially not one who was fighting for his family." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, visible and substantial but somehow ethereal. Sam had just done something that violated every principle he'd lived by for 30 years. He allowed personal morality to override professional obligation. The implications were staggering, not just for his reputation, but for his understanding of who he was and what his life had meant. Running Eagle lowered his rifle slowly, his expression shifting from acceptance of death to confusion and hope. "You will let me go? Even though there's money on my head?" "I would," Sam confirmed, "but I'm not sure it matters. You can't run forever. Boy, there are other bounty hunters, other men who won't have my particular scruples about the situation." The young warrior nodded thoughtfully, understanding the practical realities of his situation, even as he processed the unexpected mercy he'd just received. "Then I will die another day, by another man's hand. But I will remember that once, in this place, I met a white man who chose honor over profit." Sam reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the crumpled wanted poster that had started his pursuit of Running Eagle. The paper was worn from weeks of handling, its edges frayed, and its surface stained with sweat and trail dust. For a moment, he stared at the crude drawing that was supposed to represent the young warrior's face, noting how little resemblance it bore to the actual person standing before him. The poster reduced Running Eagle to a simple description: height, weight, distinguishing marks, as if a human being could be summarized in a few lines of text and a reward amount. "This says you're worth $500, Sam said, holding up the poster. "But it doesn't say anything about what those whiskey sellers did to your family. It doesn't mention that they guided cavalry to your camp or that they laughed while innocents died." He crumpled the paper in his weathered fist, then let the pieces fall to the frost-covered ground. Some things are worth more than money, and some justice can't be bought or sold. Running Eagle watched the destruction of his own wanted poster with something approaching awe. In his experience, white men valued money above all other considerations, and the sight of a bounty hunter deliberately destroying his claim to a substantial reward was almost beyond comprehension. "Why?" he asked, echoing Sam's earlier question. "Why would you give up so much for someone you barely know?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to burn away the early morning mist. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated regret and hard-won wisdom. "Because I've spent 30 years killing people for money, and I'm tired of it. Because I've seen too many good men die for bad reasons. And because—" He paused, struggling to articulate something he barely understood himself. "Because maybe it's time I did something decent before I die." The admission was more honest than Sam had been with himself in years, acknowledging truths that he'd spent decades avoiding. He was old, alone, and running out of time to make amends for a lifetime of questionable choices. Sparing Running Eagle wouldn't erase the blood on his hands, but it might represent the beginning of a different kind of ending to his violent story. "What will you do now?" Running Eagle asked. "Without the bounty money, how will you live?" Sam smiled grimly, recognizing the practical concerns underlying the question. "I'll figure something out. Maybe it's time I stopped living by the gun anyway." The two men stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, each processing the implications of what had just transpired. The sun continued its climb into the Kansas sky, casting longer shadows across the sacred hilltop, and warming the air enough to melt the frost that had covered the ground at dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the morning thermals, its cry carrying across the endless grassland like a benediction. "There is something you should know," Running Eagle said suddenly, his voice carrying an odd note of formality. "My people have been watching this place. They know of our meeting, and they have been prepared for whatever outcome the spirits chose." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How many?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. 300, Running Eagle replied calmly. "Warriors, women, elders, an entire gathering of the scattered bands. They came to witness the end of my story, whatever form it might take." The implications were staggering. Sam had thought he was pursuing a lone fugitive, but he'd actually been walking into the middle of a massive tribal gathering. If he'd killed Running Eagle as planned, he would have faced the wrath of 300 mounted Kiowa warriors with no chance of escape and no hope of survival. As if summoned by Running Eagle's words, the sound of approaching horses began to filter through the morning air. Not the thunder of a cavalry charge, but the measured cadence of a disciplined formation moving with purpose and restraint. Sam turned toward the sound and felt his breath catch in his throat as he saw them cresting the ridge to the east, a line of mounted figures silhouetted against the rising sun, like living shadows given form and substance. They came in perfect formation, 300 strong, their horses stepping with the synchronized precision of a military unit. At their head rode an older man whose bearing marked him as a chief of considerable authority, his war bonnet trailing eagle feathers that caught the morning light like captured sunbeams. Behind him rode the flower of Kiowa manhood, warriors in their prime, their faces painted for ceremony rather than war, their weapons visible but not threatening. Among them were women and elders, the keepers of tradition and wisdom whose presence transformed this from a simple war party into something approaching a sacred gathering. They rode without haste, their movements deliberate and ceremonial as they approached the hilltop, where Sam and Running Eagle waited. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, a reminder of the power and dignity of a people who had once ruled these plains but were now confined to reservations and slowly being destroyed by the relentless pressure of white expansion. Sam had fought against Indian warriors many times during his career, but he'd never seen anything quite like this, a demonstration of unity and purpose that spoke of careful planning and coordination that stretched across tribal boundaries. "My grandfather," Running Eagle said quietly, indicating the war chief who led the procession. "Stone Bear of the Red Shield Band. He raised me after my parents were first killed by soldiers, taught me the ways of war and the meaning of honor." The young warrior's voice carried deep affection and respect for the older man, emotions that Sam recognized despite the cultural differences that separated them. Family loyalty was something that transcended racial boundaries, and the bond between grandfather and grandson was universal in its power and meaning. As the procession drew closer, Sam could make out individual faces among the riders, noting the mixture of curiosity, hostility, and respect that characterized their expressions as they studied the white gunfighter who had been pursuing their young warrior for weeks. Some clearly wanted blood. Their eyes held the cold calculation of men who were prepared to kill without hesitation or regret. Others seemed more interested in understanding what had transpired on the sacred hilltop, their faces reflecting the kind of careful evaluation that characterized people who valued wisdom above violence. Stone Bear urged his horse forward, separating himself from the main body of riders as he approached the summit, where Sam and Running Eagle waited. He was an impressive figure, tall and straight despite his advanced age, his weathered face bearing the ceremonial scars of a warrior who had proven himself in countless battles. His dark eyes held depths of experience and wisdom that reminded Sam of his own reflection, though the chief's gaze carried a serenity that the gunfighter had never achieved. "Grandfather," Running Eagle said formally, using the traditional greeting between a young warrior and his elder. "I have met the hunter who pursued me, and we have spoken of justice and mercy." Stone Bear's eyes moved from his grandson to Sam, studying the white gunfighter with the careful attention of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to read character in faces and bearing. What he saw seemed to surprise him. Not the cold killer he had expected, but a man who carried the weight of moral conflict in his expression. "You are the one called Iron Sam," the chief said in English that was precise and unaccented. "Your reputation reaches even to our isolated camps. We know of your skill with weapons and your success in hunting those who flee from white man's justice." Sam nodded, recognizing the formal courtesy that characterized first meetings between worthy opponents. "I am, and you are Stone Bear, war chief of the Red Shield Band. Your reputation for wisdom and courage is equally well known among my people." The formal exchange of recognition between Sam and Stone Bear carried weight that went far beyond simple politeness. In acknowledging each other's reputations and achievements, they were establishing the kind of mutual respect that was necessary for meaningful communication between representatives of two cultures that had been at war for generations. The other mounted warriors watched this diplomatic dance with keen interest, understanding that the outcome of this conversation would determine whether the morning ended in bloodshed or something approaching reconciliation. "My grandson tells me that you chose not to kill him, despite the bounty on his head and the long pursuit that brought you here," Stone Bear said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was still evaluating the situation. "This is unexpected from a man of your profession." Sam felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes upon him as he considered his response. Every word he spoke would be weighed and measured not just by Stone Bear, but by the entire gathering of warriors, women, and elders who had come to witness this unprecedented encounter. The wrong words could trigger violence that would leave the hilltop littered with bodies, while the right ones might create possibilities that none of them had imagined. "Your grandson is a warrior who fought for his family," Sam replied carefully. "In my understanding, such fighting brings honor rather than shame. I have killed many men in my time, but I prefer not to kill those who act from noble motives." Stone Bear's expression remained neutral, but Sam caught a flicker of something that might have been approval in the chief's dark eyes. "You speak of honor and noble motives. These are concepts that many of your people seem to have forgotten in their dealings with mine." The observation carried an edge of bitterness that reflected decades of broken treaties, massacred villages, and casual betrayals that had characterized the relationship between white settlers and Native American tribes. Sam had witnessed enough of that history firsthand to understand the chief's skepticism about white concepts of honor and morality. "Some of my people have forgotten," Sam admitted, "just as some of yours have chosen war over peace when other paths were available. But individual men can still choose to act with honor, regardless of what their peoples have done to each other." It was a distinction that carried profound implications for the conversation they were having. By speaking of individual choice rather than tribal or racial loyalty, Sam was suggesting that personal morality could transcend the historical conflicts that had divided their peoples. It was a concept that appealed to the Kiowa understanding of warrior culture, which had always emphasized individual courage and honor above collective identity. Running Eagle stepped forward, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone making an official declaration. "Grandfather, this man chose mercy when he could have chosen profit. He destroyed the paper that would have paid him for my death, saying that some things are worth more than money. I believe he speaks with a straight tongue." The endorsement from his grandson clearly carried weight with Stone Bear, who nodded slowly as he processed this information. In Kiowa culture, a warrior's word was sacred, and Running Eagle's testimony about Sam's actions would be accepted without question or doubt. "If this is true," Stone Bear said, "then Iron Sam has done something that will be remembered in our stories long after all of us have joined our ancestors. The man who chose honor over gold, mercy over blood. Such men are rare in any people." The chief's words carried the weight of formal recognition, acknowledging Sam's actions not just as individual choices, but as deeds worthy of tribal memory and respect. It was an honor that few white men had ever received from the Kiowa, and it came with obligations and expectations that Sam was only beginning to understand. What happened next would be remembered in both white and Native American communities for generations to come, becoming the stuff of legend and the subject of countless stories told around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. Stone Bear raised his hand, and the 300 mounted warriors, women, and elders who had gathered to witness this encounter began to dismount with the synchronized precision of a military ceremony. The sound of boots and moccasins hitting the ground echoed across the sacred hilltop like distant thunder, creating a rhythm that seemed to connect the assembled people with the very heartbeat of the earth itself. Sam watched in growing amazement as the entire gathering arranged itself in a vast semicircle around the summit, where he stood with Running Eagle and Stone Bear. The formation was both beautiful and impressive. representing a display of unity and coordination that spoke of careful planning and deep cultural traditions. Men who had fought cavalry units, women who had survived forced marches to reservations, elders who remembered the days when buffalo darkened plains, all had come together to witness and participate in this unprecedented moment of recognition between former enemies. "Iron Sam," Stone Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "You have shown mercy to one of our young warriors when mercy was neither expected nor required. You have chosen honor over profit, compassion over duty, and in doing so you have demonstrated the kind of character that we value above all other qualities." The chief paused, allowing his words to be absorbed by both the gathered tribe's people and the lone gunfighter, who stood at the center of their attention. "Among our people, such actions create obligations and relationships that transcend the boundaries of blood and tribe. You have earned a place in our stories and our respect." Stone Bear then did something that no white man in the territory had ever witnessed. He removed a sacred eagle feather from his war bonnet and approached Sam with the solemn bearing of someone conducting a religious ceremony. The feather was beautiful beyond description, its surface marked with traditional symbols that told the story of courage in battle and wisdom in council. It represented not just personal achievement, but recognition from an entire people of character and honor that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. "This feather has been in my family for 5 generations," Stone Bear said as he prepared to place it in Sam's weathered hand. "It was earned by my great-grandfather in battle against the Pawnee, carried by my grandfather during the great buffalo hunts, and blessed by my father in the sacred ceremonies that bind our people to the land and sky." The chief's eyes met Sam's with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. "I give it to you not as a white man, but as a warrior who has proven himself worthy of respect. Wear it with honor, and know that you are welcome in our camps and protected by our warriors." Sam accepted the feather with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the honor being bestowed upon him. In 30 years of frontier life, he had received rewards and recognition from army commanders, territorial governors, and wealthy ranchers, but none of those acknowledgments had carried the emotional weight of this simple gift from a people he had spent years fighting against. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotions he didn't fully understand. "I don't know if I deserve this, but I'll try to live up to it." Stone Bear smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Sam had seen from him. A man who questions whether he deserves honor is precisely the kind of man who does deserve it. Those who assume they are worthy rarely are. Then, in a gesture that would be talked about throughout the territory for decades to come, Stone Bear stepped back and bowed deeply to the white gunfighter, his movement fluid and ceremonial, as befitted a formal acknowledgment of respect between equals. The sight of the proud war chief showing such deference to a former enemy sent a ripple of amazement through the assembled gathering, but also triggered something even more remarkable. As Stone Bear completed his bow and straightened his full height, a murmur passed through the assembled crowd like wind through wheat. Then, in a movement that seemed to flow naturally from some shared understanding, the entire gathering, 300 warriors, women, elders, and children, began to bow in unison. The sight was breathtaking in its scope and profound in its implications. This wasn't the forced submission of a conquered people, but the voluntary recognition of honor by those who understood its true value. Each person in the vast semicircle bowed according to their own cultural traditions, warriors with the sharp, precise movements of those who had proven themselves in battle, women with the graceful dignity of those who had borne and raised the next generation, elders with the careful deliberation of those who had accumulated decades of wisdom and experience. The children, following their parent example, bowed with the unconscious innocence of those who understood that they were witnessing something important even if they couldn't fully comprehend its significance. Sam stood at the center of this unprecedented display, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of conflict and misunderstanding being lifted from his shoulders by the simple recognition that honor and decency could exist regardless of race or culture. The eagle feather in his hand seemed to pulse with its own life, connecting him to traditions and values that transcended the narrow boundaries of his own violent profession. For the first time in 30 years, he felt truly worthy of respect. Not because of his skill with weapons or his reputation as a killer, but because of a single moment when he had chosen compassion over profit and mercy over duty. Running Eagle stepped forward, his young face radiant with something approaching joy. "Grandfather, I asked permission to accompany Iron Sam on his journey, to learn from his wisdom and to serve as a bridge between our peoples." The request was both unexpected and profound, representing not just a personal choice, but a symbolic gesture toward reconciliation and understanding. Stone Bear considered the proposal carefully, his weathered face reflecting the kind of deep thought that preceded important decisions. "It is a good thought," he said finally, "but dangerous for both of you. There are those among my people who would see such an alliance as betrayal, just as there are those among the white communities who would view it as treason." The chief's eyes moved between his grandson and Sam, weighing possibilities and consequences with the careful attention of someone who understood that individual choices could have far-reaching effects. But perhaps it is time for new alliances and new understandings. Perhaps the old ways of war and hatred have brought us nothing but sorrow and loss. Stone Bear turned to address the assembled gathering, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led his people through decades of crisis and change. "My grandson Running Eagle will ride with Iron Sam, not as prisoner and captor, but as partners in a new understanding between our peoples. They will carry our respect to the white communities, and they will bring news of white honor back to our camps." The announcement sent another murmur through the crowd, though this time it carried undertones of approval and excitement rather than surprise. The idea of a formal alliance between a Kiowa warrior and a white gunfighter was unprecedented, but also offered hope for a different kind of future, one based on mutual respect rather than mutual destruction. "This is a great honor," Sam said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "I accept your grandson as my partner and your people as my allies. Together, we'll try to build something better than what we've inherited from the past." The words were simple, but they carried weight that would echo through history. On a wind-swept hilltop in Kansas, 300 Native Americans and one aging gunfighter had created something new, an alliance based not on political necessity or economic advantage, but on the recognition that honor and decency were universal values that could bridge any divide. As the sun climbed higher into the Kansas sky, transforming the early morning chill into the promise of a warm day, the gathering began to disperse with the same quiet dignity that had characterized its formation. But this wasn't simply an ending. It was a beginning, the start of something that would ripple outward from this sacred hilltop to touch communities throughout the territory. The 300 members of the assembled tribes mounted their horses with practiced efficiency, but their departure was unhurried, ceremonial rather than urgent. They had accomplished what they came to do: witness the transformation of an enemy into an ally, and participate in the creation of a new understanding between peoples who had been at war for generations. Stone Bear approached Sam one final time before departure, his weather hands extended in the traditional gesture of farewell between equals. "Iron Sam," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal pronouncement, "you go now with protection of the Kiowa people. Your enemies become our enemies. Your friends become our friends. This bond will endure as long as grass grows and water flows." The chief's eyes moved to his grandson, who stood ready to begin a journey that would test everything he had learned about courage, honor, and the possibility of peace between natural enemies. "Running Eagle, you carry the hopes of our people with you. Remember always that you represent not just yourself, but all those who believe that understanding is stronger than hatred." The young warrior nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility that had been placed upon his shoulders. "I will remember, grandfather, and I will return with stories of honor found in unexpected places." The formal farewells completed, the great gathering began its departure, flowing down from the hilltop like water returning to the sea. Sam watched them go with something approaching awe, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. In the space of a few hours, he had been transformed from a bounty hunter pursuing a fugitive into an honored ally of people he had spent years fighting against. Running Eagle mounted his horse, then paused to look back at the departing members of his extended family. "They came so far to witness this moment," he said quietly. "Word will spread throughout all the tribes, the story of the white gunfighter who chose mercy over money, who saw a warrior's honor even in an enemy." Sam swung into his own saddle, the sacred eagle feather now secured in his hatband, where it would serve as a constant reminder of the choice that had changed his life. "Where do we go now?" he asked, though he suspected that the destination mattered less than the journey itself. "East," Running Eagle replied. To the towns and settlements where fear and hatred have taken root, we'll carry the message that peace is possible when men of good will choose understanding over violence. It was an ambitious goal, perhaps an impossible one, but Sam found himself looking forward to the challenge. For 30 years, he had been an instrument of death and division. Now, for however much time remained to him, he would try to be something else, a bridge between worlds, a living example that redemption was possible even for those who had traveled the darkest paths. As they rode down from the sacred hilltop, Sam felt the weight of his violent past beginning to lift from his shoulders, replaced by something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. The eagle feather in his hatband caught the morning sunlight, and for the first time in years, Samuel, Iron Sam, McCready rode toward an uncertain future with something approaching peace in his weather heart. Behind them, the sacred ground where 300 warriors had bowed to honor a former enemy remained empty except for the wind and the endless Kansas sky. But the memory of what had transpired there would live on in the stories told around countless fires, a reminder that even in the harshest corners of the American frontier, mercy could triumph over vengeance, and understanding could bridge the deepest divides between peoples who have forgotten how to see each other as human beings. The old gunslinger and the young warrior rode east together, carrying with them the seeds of a new understanding that would grow and spread long after both of them had returned to the earth from which all warriors ultimately came. Their alliance would be tested, their message would be challenged, and their faith in the possibility of peace would be strained by the realities of a world still dominated by fear and hatred. But they would persist because they had learned something on that wind-swept hilltop that would sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead, that honor recognized no boundaries of race or culture, and that the choice between violence and mercy was one that every person faced regardless of their past or their profession.